never imagined that silence could hurt more than a bullet. But that day, at that station, the pain was different. The trains arrived a little after 10 in the morning. The ground trembled beneath my feet. The entire city seemed to have gathered there, in Kansas City, Missouri, to welcome their men back. American flags hung from every window. Children ran with flowers in their hands. Women in light dresses held signs with names, arms ready for embraces, tears caught on their lashes. And I was there, in my navy blue dress, the same one I wore the day he left, because I promised, because I believed that if he saw me dressed as I had been on that morning of goodbye, everything would fall back into place. The locomotive slowed to a stop. The shouts began. "There he is! My God, you're back!" People threw themselves into soldiers' arms, kisses that couldn't fit on their faces. Mothers fainted from joy, and I searched for only one thing: his eyes. I saw him. First the hair, shaved, then the shoulders, more slumped, the wrinkled uniform, pale skin. But it was him. It was my William. I swear to God, I saw him look at me, but it was as if he were looking straight through me. He looked. He saw me, but he didn't stop. He didn't smile. He didn't run toward me like he had promised in his letters. He simply lowered his head and kept walking with the others. For a second, I thought it was a mistake, that he hadn't recognized me in the confusion, that he would turn back, that he would look over his shoulder. But he kept walking, as if I were part of the crowd, as if he had never loved me. My hands shook so badly that the bouquet fell. No one saw it. No one noticed. People were too busy being happy. Everyone except me. Everyone except him. Hours later, when I returned home, I found his suitcase on the back porch. Someone had left it there. Maybe him. Maybe a neighbor. Inside, the smell of Europe still lived among the clothes. The sound of the zipper made me cry. It was real. He was here. But he wasn't. That day, I understood something no one ever told me. Not every man who comes back from war comes back whole, and some don't come back to the ones who waited. I loved him for 1,132 days. And when I finally saw him again, he was a stranger. But do you know what was worse? Something in his eyes was screaming. Something in his silence was begging me. Don't ask. Don't push. Just let me come back. The only way I can. But how do you love someone who no longer knows where home is? How do you wait for someone who has already returned and is still lost? That night, I slept holding the letter he had sent me 2 years earlier, when he still said he dreamed of our reunion. Now, the reunion had happened, and all I felt was a huge hollow space between us. And that was only the beginning. The letters were everything I had. When William left for Europe in 1942, he promised he would write whenever he could. He promised he wouldn't let time erase us. That love would endure. And I believed him. At first, the letters arrived often. Once a month, sometimes even twice. Short, heavily censored lines crossed out by army officers. But still, it was him. He called me my April flower. He told me about the cold in England, about missing the cornbread and coffee only I knew how to make. He never said exactly where he was. Everything was vague, generic, but every envelope carried the smell of ink, sweat, and distance. Over time, the gaps grew longer. 3 months without a letter, then 5. And when one finally arrived, it was like a beam of sunlight cutting through my chest. I'm fine. Don't worry. I still think of you every night. That was all I needed to survive another winter without him. The war devoured the world out there. Here, I had only silence. I remember one letter in particular. It was April of 1944. I spent my birthday alone for the third time since he left. The next morning, the letter arrived. Just 3 lines. I dreamed of you dancing in our bedroom, to that old record that always skipped. I danced behind you, holding your waist, and you laughed. I miss that so much. I read it at least 40 times. I wanted to dance alone, and I did. I closed my eyes and imagined him there. It sounds foolish now, but that night, I slept with one of his shoes beside the bed, just to feel like he was still with me. Each letter was a thin thread, keeping me tied to the idea that he would come back, that nothing would change. And even when his handwriting began to change, less firm, more spaced out, I refused to see it as a sign. The last letter arrived 8 months before the end of the war. It was strange, brief. He didn't call me my flower. He only said they were moving into the interior of France, and that he might not be able to write for a while. After that, emptiness. Weeks turned into months. Neighbors began to whisper that something might have happened. But I said no. I said, he promised me. He's coming back. And he did come back. But that look was the same as in the last letter. Distant, hard. As if some part of him had been buried somewhere between Normandy and Germany. As if the words that once saved us were now trapped inside a heart that could no longer open. It's strange. For years, I believed my letters kept him alive. But today, I wonder if it wasn't the other way around. If it wasn't me who stayed alive, waiting for something that, deep down, had already died out there. The war ended, but he never walked into the house. William came back. I saw him with my own eyes. I saw him at the station. I saw his clothes on the porch. I saw his footprints in the muddy yard after the rain. But coming in, truly coming home, he never did. In the first few days, he stayed at his mother's house 2 blocks up from mine. I kept telling myself it was only a matter of time, that he needed to rest, to adjust, to breathe for a while. But days turned into weeks, and the weeks into silence. One afternoon I went there. I knocked on the door with a corn cake he loved. Mrs. Lucille, his mother, answered. She looked at me as if she were seeing a ghost and said, almost in a whisper, "He's sleeping. He doesn't want to see anyone." But I knew it was a lie. His car was out front. The radio was playing inside the house. And even so, he didn't come to the door. Not a wave. Not a word. I walked back home, the cake cooling in my hands and my heart collapsing inside my chest. Kansas City no longer felt the same. The city celebrated the end of the war as if everything were finally right. Weddings, parties, toasts on the sidewalks, men with medals on their chests, women pregnant with hope. Except me. I had no medal, no ring, no embrace. I had only a man who crossed oceans, faced bombs, survived trenches, but didn't have the courage to cross the doorway of the home we had built together in our dreams. I remember stepping into our old bedroom. The smell of mildew was already settling in. The sheets were untouched. On the nightstand, the frame with our photos slowly yellowed with time. I sat on the bed, took a deep breath, and understood. He didn't come back for me. He came back to some version of himself I didn't know. It wasn't physical exhaustion. It was something else. Something in his eyes. Something in his silence. The neighbors began to talk. Maybe he's gone mad, they said. Or maybe he's ashamed of coming back different. But I didn't want judgments. I just wanted to understand. One day he passed me on the street. By chance. I was carrying a basket of bread. He was walking slowly, head down. When our eyes met, for a moment I thought he would stop. but he didn't. He looked at me, as if he were seeing me for the first time. Then he lowered his eyes and kept walking. As if our story were nothing more than a distant memory he preferred to erase. That night, I understood that sometimes wars don't end when the shooting stops. They go on. Inside us. And William, even on American soil, was still fighting to leave the battlefield. That year, Kansas City seemed to live in a permanent patriotic holiday. Storefronts were covered in flags, children learned anthems at school, and City Hall organized dances to honor those who came back alive. The streets were full of smiles, but behind every smile, there was something forced, as if everyone were trying to forget. The men had returned, yes, but they hadn't returned the same. Some laughed too loudly. Others didn't speak at all. And everyone pretended. They pretended that everything was back to normal, including William. I saw him twice that week. The first time, sitting alone on a park bench, staring at the ground, motionless. The second, when he was called onto the church stage during a tribute to the brave men who served their country. He stepped up, stiffened his body, accepted the certificate. The crowd stood and applauded, and he didn't even smile. After that, he disappeared again. People said, "At least he came back." But no one wanted to know how he came back. No one wanted to hear about the sleepless nights, the screams in the dark, the smell of death soaked into his skin. It was as if the entire country had decided that now was the time to forget. To work, marry, have children, and be grateful. But what if someone couldn't follow that script? He said nothing. But I saw it. I saw in his eyes the weight of something no one wanted to carry. Something he held in his chest. But that here simply had no place to exist. Once I went back to his mother's house again. I knocked. I waited. This time he opened the door himself. For a second, time stopped. He was thin, with deep dark circles under his eyes, his beard untrimmed. Then he said, "You shouldn't have come." I held back my tears. I asked if he was all right. He answered, "No one wants to know what it was like. They just want us to be grateful for coming back, and to smile, as if it were easy." I stood there, not knowing what to say, and before I could answer anything, he closed the door. That night, I sat alone on my porch, listening to fireworks from yet another city celebration. Inside my living room, the radio played cheerful songs, but in my chest, there was only silence. The same silence that swallowed William, the same one the city pretended didn't exist. And that was when I realized he couldn't speak, and no one wanted to listen, because the war may have ended out there. But inside him, it was still happening. I thought love could heal anything. Maybe it was naivete or desperation. But after that door closed, I refused to give up. I began leaving small notes in his mother's mailbox. Simple things. I baked pumpkin bread today. "There's a storm coming. If you want to talk, you know where to find me. I thought of you while listening to Billie Holiday." I never got a reply, but I kept going. Over time, I managed to convince him to see me. I don't know if it was persistence or pity. He started coming by my house on Friday afternoons. He arrived quietly, sat on the living room sofa, and accepted a cup of tea. We stayed together for 20-30 minutes, in silence. Sometimes I talked about the market, the neighbor who bought a new car, the woman who had a baby on the street behind ours. He just listened, barely reacted. But I kept trying, because the love I felt for him was still alive. I still remembered the smell of his neck, the sound of his laugh, the way he would pull me by the waist to dance in the kitchen when dinner went wrong. So I tried to recreate that. I cooked our favorite recipes, set the table with the china set my father gave us before he left. Put on the record we used to play on Sundays, the one that skipped in the middle of the chorus. And I waited. He arrived, sat down, ate in silence, and when the record began to play, I stood up and held out my hand. "Come dance with me, just a little, like before." He looked at me, a hard, confused, distant look. "I'm not that man anymore, Rosa." Hearing my name from his mouth sent a shiver through me, because it had been months since he'd called me that. "But I'm still that woman," I replied. He lowered his eyes, and for the first time, I saw tears. But they weren't tears of love. They were tears of guilt, of pain, of someone who wanted to come back, but no longer knew the way. He didn't dance. He didn't hold me. And when he left something behind. The wristwatch he wore before the war. The same one I gave him on the anniversary of our engagement. I held that watch as if it were a part of him, as if time, in that moment, had stopped. But the truth is, time moved on, and the place I once occupied no longer existed. He came back, but he came back full of shadows, voices, memories I would never live. And everything I tried to offer, our love, our memories, felt far too small compared to what he carried. I began to understand that perhaps I was trying to fill a space that was no longer mine. Or worse, that perhaps that space no longer existed at all. And that hurt more than the waiting. I had always known there were things William didn't say, but in the last few weeks, something began to change. And it wasn't just his silence. It was the way he reacted to things, as if he were trying to hide not only what he felt, but who he was now. It all began with a simple conversation. I mentioned that the neighbor's son, little Charlie, had broken his arm climbing a tree. And suddenly William froze. He went pale. His hands trembled slightly on his knee. I asked if he was all right. He stood up, walked to the window, and said, "Children shouldn't get hurt." That was all. But the way he said it, as if he were speaking to someone else, or to another memory. The following week, I noticed something else. He confused the name of our old dog, Bella, with the name of someone he had never mentioned before. Thomas. "Do you remember when Thomas used to get tangled in the curtains?" he said with a faint laugh. I frowned. "Who is Thomas?" He looked at me for a second, and smiled in a strange, forced way. "Oh, nothing. Forget it." But I didn't forget. And that's how it began. Small lapses. A name. A distant look. An emotion that arrived too late. I started noticing that he avoided talking about France. Avoided mentioning the last year of the war. Whenever the subject drifted in that direction, he changed it, or suddenly became aggressive. One night, during dinner, I mentioned a newspaper article about soldiers missing in action. He dropped his fork. His hand clenched tightly. I saw the muscle in his jaw twitch. "What is it?" I asked. "We're not talking about that," he said coldly. "But William," I said, "we're not talking about that." It was the first time he had ever shouted at me. And then, the silence returned. Only now, it was heavier. I left early that night. I got home shaking. Something inside me told me it wasn't just trauma. It wasn't just pain. It was a secret. A secret he carried so tightly it was starting to tear him apart from the inside. And that's when I realized he wasn't just trying to forget what he had lived through. He was hiding something specific, something with a name, something he couldn't put into words. And maybe that something had to do with the name he had spoken by accident. Thomas. And what hurt me most was thinking that perhaps, within that silence, lay buried the truth that could change everything I still believed about the two of us. After that night, I began to observe everything more closely. I started to notice that even when he was with me, William seemed to be somewhere else. It wasn't just sadness. It was as if there was someone between us, someone I couldn't see, and little by little, that someone began to take shape. At Mrs. Lucille's house, his mother's, I accidentally found a wooden box, old, poorly closed, hidden at the back of the sewing room closet. She had asked me to fetch embroidery thread, and there it was, a box filled with correspondence, letters. Some appeared to be written by soldiers, others were in French. One of them, on yellowed paper folded several times, bore the name that had been haunting me since that dinner, Thomas. My heart raced. I didn't have the courage to read the letters then, but the discovery burned inside me. I waited until Mrs. Lucille went to the market, returned to the box, and opened it carefully. There they were, letters exchanged between William and Thomas, dated from 1943 through the end of the war. Time had marked the words. Thomas's handwriting was steady, beautiful. The lines began with simple things, updates from the front, inside jokes, comments about the terrible coffee. But soon, they became something else. I don't know how I would endure all this if it weren't for you. Last night, I dreamed we were walking down a street in Paris, just you and me, at peace. Promise that if one of us doesn't make it back, the other will keep remembering. I closed the letter with trembling hands. There was love there, a love never openly spoken, perhaps never consummated, but alive, real. A bond born in the middle of destruction, and one that, clearly, for William, still existed. I returned home in shock. I spent hours sitting in the kitchen, staring at the kettle with no fire under it. Part of me wanted to run to him, scream, demand explanations. The other part just wanted to understand. How can someone create a new love while the old one is still waiting? But I realized that what they lived wasn't betrayal. It was survival. I knew William before the war, but Thomas knew the man the war created. And perhaps because of that, he became indispensable. The realization hit me hard. I was no longer his safe harbor. Someone else had taken that place. Someone who shared with him the terror, the fear, the cold of the trenches, the screams in the night. And worst of all, perhaps that someone never came back. And that would explain everything. The pain in his eyes, the emptiness, the guilt, the silence. He wasn't just sad, he was grieving. Not for me, for Thomas. The deepest loneliness is realizing you were never alone, in something you believed belonged only to you. For years I waited. I waited with love, with faith, with tears. I wrote letters. I made promises. I saved memories. I believed that what kept William alive was our love, what I felt for him, what he felt for me. But now I knew. I wasn't the only one who waited. Thomas waited too. He waited for answers. He waited to survive. He waited for a return that may never have happened. And William waited for him. Not for me. In the days following the discovery of the letters, I entered a kind of numbness. I began moving through the house like a visitor. Every object that once reminded me of William now hurt. The picture frame? False. The watch left on the dresser? A weight. The bed where I dreamed of our reunion? Cold. One afternoon, I went down to the basement looking for old boxes. And there, I found a forgotten folder among dusty books. Inside were newspaper clippings in French, blurred photos of soldiers in the field, and a letter that was never sent. It was from William. addressed to Thomas, written a few weeks before the end of the war. He never had the courage to send it, but he kept it. Thomas, if you're reading this, it means we made it, or almost. Today, I caught myself imagining what it would be like to come back and try to live without you. People will expect me to return to who I was before, to the life I had before. But the truth is, that version of me died in the field. What's left is the man who survived beside you. I read it in silence. I didn't cry. Not then, because what I felt was something beyond pain. It was surrender, a bitter understanding. All that time, I believed William would come back to me because he loved me. But he survived, because he loved someone while he was there, and that someone was waiting for him too, in a different way, without guarantees, without promises ever made. War is not made to keep promises. And when I finally looked at myself in the mirror, I realized I wasn't fighting another woman. It wasn't jealousy. It wasn't betrayal. It was something more cruel. The reality that, on the battlefield, love can change its shape, and what existed between them was real. It was born from fear, loss, blood, and the need not to lose one's mind. And now, I understood. I understood William's silence. I understood why he didn't touch me, why he never spoke about what he lived through. Because deep down, he was no longer waiting for me. He was waiting to wake up one day and convince himself that Thomas hadn't died. But he had. And with him, the last part of the man I loved died too. I think, deep down, I always knew. From the moment I saw William at the station, with that look that didn't recognize me, something told me he hadn't come back alone. Or rather, that he had come back carrying someone with him. And now I knew that someone's name. I knew the face. The bond. I knew Thomas wasn't just a memory. He was an open wound. What I still didn't know was how he died, and why that guilt was devouring William from the inside. The answer came on a gray November morning, shortly before Thanksgiving. I went to bring Mrs. Lucille an apple pie, an almost automatic gesture, an excuse to stay close. She was sitting alone, hollow-eyed, holding a letter. When she saw me, she simply handed me the envelope, like someone who could no longer carry so much weight alone. He gave me this letter weeks after he came back, told me to keep it, in case one day it was necessary. It was a letter from William, but not to me. It was to himself. As if, for the first time, he were trying to say out loud what he never had the courage to share with anyone. The trembling handwriting began like this. If someone is reading this, it's because I couldn't move on. My heart stopped. I kept reading, my hands cold. That day, in June of '44, we were surrounded. Thomas and I. We were in a village in northern France. The unit had split up. We lost contact with command. He was hit first. I tried to drag him to a barn. It was raining. There was blood everywhere. He looked at me and said, "Don't leave me here." But I heard footsteps. I ran. I left him. It felt like being shot. The letter continued. The time it took me to run and hide was not enough to forget. I heard the shots. I heard his scream. And every night since I came back, I wake up with that sound. There is no love, no home, no country that can make me forget what I did. I survived, and he didn't, because I ran. I lowered the letter, and everything made sense. William wasn't just grieving. He felt guilty for being alive. He carried the weight of an impossible choice on his back. Save himself, or die with him. And since then, he had been trapped in that guilt. In that dark room inside his own mind, where there was no space left for anyone else. Not even me. That night, I went out onto my porch and looked at the sky. It was clear. The stars felt closer than ever. I thought of William. I thought of Thomas. And for the first time, I didn't cry for myself. I cried for them. For the two men who loved each other in silence, in the hell of war, and who would never have the chance to live that love in the light of day. I cried for everything they lost, for the pain of having to move forward with a hole in the chest. And finally, I understood. William came back different, because a part of him stayed there, in that barn, dead beside Thomas, buried under the weight of a decision no man should ever have to make. On the morning I decided to see him one last time, I didn't get dressed up. I didn't choose the blue dress. I didn't put on lipstick. I didn't bring letters. I went with only a clean heart, and one certainty: I couldn't save him. And more importantly, he didn't want to be saved. William was sitting on his mother's porch, staring at nothing. He looked smaller, as if he had folded in on himself. I stopped at the sidewalk. He saw me, and this time, he spoke first. Rosa. There was a tiredness in his voice that went straight through me. I climbed the 2 steps and sat beside him. We stayed silent for a few seconds. The world seemed to breathe slowly. Then he said, "I don't know who I am anymore." It took me a moment to answer, but when I did, it was calmly. "I don't know who I am anymore, without you." He turned his face. There were tears, but there was also peace. As if, finally saying it, he had released a weight. But I already knew. I already understood what was coming. "You still love him, don't you?" I asked. He didn't deny it. He didn't confirm it. He simply closed his eyes and said, "I never loved anyone like that. And I'll never be able to again." My chest tightened, but it was a clean ache, without anger, without drama, just truth. I held his hand, and for the first time in a long while, he held mine back. "I waited for you, William, all those years. I know. But the man I waited for died there," he finished. And in that moment, we both knew. There was no way to keep trying to resurrect what no longer existed. He came back from the war, but he didn't come back to me, because he didn't come back whole, because the love we had didn't survive, not for lack of feeling, but because sometimes loving also means letting go. It means recognizing that what remains is not enough to begin again. The following week, William moved away. He went to live alone, in a more isolated place near the mountains. He said he needed air, silence. He left no phone number, only a letter, with a few words. "Thank you for loving me even when I couldn't. For seeing me when I was hiding, and for understanding what even I couldn't understand. Thomas would have liked you." I folded the letter carefully. I placed it inside a book, and I cried, not for the loss, but for the end of the waiting. The war ended, but the love ended in a different way. Not with hatred, not with guilt, but with silence. A silence that says, we loved each other, but it didn't work. And that's okay. Today, when I think of William, I don't feel pain. I feel longing, and a deep respect for the life he lived, even without me. Because true love sometimes isn't the one that ends together. It's the one that remains at peace, even apart. And I learned that waiting for someone doesn't guarantee they'll come back to you, but it proves that you had the courage to love until the very end.